Look, it's not like Mark and I had fireworks or anything when we met. We just clicked, you know? We were two people who found out we fit well together, and that was that. Love came later, like a surprise guest at a party you didn't know you were throwing. I'm Emily, by the way. Emily Johnson. Well, now it's Patterson since I married Mark. Mark's a great guy, steady and kind. But his family? That's a whole other story. His dad, Mr. Patterson, he's all right. A quiet man who loves his garden more than anything. But his mom, Mrs. Patterson, and I, we just never hit it off. Then there's Linda, married to Mark's older brother Dave. She's the perfect daughter-in-law, always agreeing with Mrs. Patterson, always a step ahead in pleasing her. It's like she's playing a role in some drama where she's the star, and Mrs. Patterson is the adoring audience. So, one day, we're all at their place for dinner. Mark and I, Dave and Linda, and the Pattersons, of course. Mrs. Patterson's going on and on about their new house. You know, the one they got with a huge mortgage? She's like a broken record, always comparing it to our small apartment. Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. You really should think about upgrading, Emily. Living in such a cramped space, it's just sad. I tried to keep my cool. We're happy with what we have, Mrs. Patterson. It's cozy. Linda chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Oh, but just imagine having a place like this. You must be so envious. Mark squeezed my hand under the table, a silent plea for me to let it go. I bit my tongue and forced a smile. Yeah, Linda, maybe one day, I said, keeping my voice light. Mr. Patterson, trying to change the subject, asked Mark about his work. I was grateful for the distraction. Mark talked about his latest project, and for a moment, we all fell into a more comfortable conversation. But Mrs. Patterson couldn't help herself. Well, it's good you're keeping busy, Mark. But with Emily not working, I do wonder how you manage. It must be tough. I felt my face flush. Actually, I've been thinking about starting my own business, I said, more to stand my ground than anything else. Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow. A business? What can you possibly do? Before I could answer, Linda laughed. Oh, let's not bore ourselves with fantasies. More wine, anyone? The evening dragged on, filled with more jabs and thinly veiled insults. By the time Mark and I got back to our apartment, I was fuming. Mark tried to calm me down. Hey, just ignore them. We know what we have, and that's all that matters. I nodded, but inside, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being looked down upon, of being the underdog in a family that thrived on appearances and material wealth. Little did I know, things were about to get a whole lot more complicated. Life's funny, you know. One minute you're thinking you've got it all figured out, and the next, you're wondering how you got stuck in this sitcom of a family drama. That's how it felt every time we visited Mark's parents. Their new house was like a trophy, big, shiny, and always on display. I remember this one Saturday. Mark and I were at our place, enjoying our usual lazy morning routine, when he got a call from his dad, asking if we could come over. I knew what that meant. Another round of show off the house and make Emily feel small. We got there, and Mrs. Patterson was in full hostess mode, guiding us through rooms we'd seen a dozen times already. And here's the new coffee table we got. Italian marble, you know. It's quite expensive, but you get what you pay for. Mark, bless him, always tried to be diplomatic. Looks great, Mom. Really ties the room together. I just nodded along. What else could I do? Then came the inevitable comparison. I just can't imagine how you two manage in that tiny apartment of yours. It must feel so cramped, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice all sugary concern. I felt my patience wearing thin. It's not that bad, Mrs. Patterson. We like it. She tisked, shaking her head. But you deserve better, Emily. A woman should have a proper home, not some shoebox. Before I could bite back a retort, Mark's dad, Mr. Patterson, called out from the kitchen. Anyone wants a beer? I'll help you, Dad, Mark said quickly, giving me a look that said, Please, no drama. I was left alone with Mrs. Patterson and Linda. Linda, ever the eager sidekick, piped up. You know, Emily, there's a certain charm to living minimally, but of course, it's not for everyone. Some of us prefer comfort. Exactly, Linda. Comfort and style, Mrs. Patterson added, glancing around her lavish living room. I forced a smile. Well, everyone has their own taste, right? We're happy with what we have. Mrs. Patterson sniffed. Of course, dear. Happiness is all relative after all. The rest of the visit was more of the same subtle digs and not so subtle boasts. By the time we left, I was mentally exhausted. On the drive back, Mark tried to lighten the mood. Hey, don't let them get to you. You know how they are. I sighed, staring out the window. I know, it feels like it's never going to end, you know? Mark reached over and squeezed my hand. We'll get through it. We always do. But as we drove back to our shoebox, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of frustration. Why did it always have to be a competition with them? Why couldn't they just be happy for us as we were? Life's like a roller coaster, they say. You never see the twist coming. That week was one such twist for me. I got a call from my mom, telling me that Grandpa had passed away. I was heartbroken, of course. He was always kind to me, a bit of a silent supporter in my corner. The shock came when we found out he left me a pretty hefty sum, $500,000. I couldn't believe it. Mark was happy for me, in his quiet way. That's great, Em. Grandpa really cared about you. But when we told his family, well, that was a whole different story. We were at another family dinner when I mentioned it, not thinking much of it. Mrs. Patterson's eyes lit up like Christmas lights. $500,000? My word, Emily, that's quite a sum. Linda was quick to add her 2 cents. Oh, the things you could do with that money. But the mood shifted when Mr. Patterson coughed, a deep, rattling sound that had us all looking his way. He waved us off. Just a bit under the weather, that's all. The conversation moved on, but I couldn't shake off the concern for Mr. Patterson. He looked pale, more tired than usual. It was only a couple of days later when we got the news. Mark's voice was somber when he told me, Dad's sick, Em. Really sick. The doctors are saying it's serious. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. How bad? Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. They're not sure. Could be weeks, maybe less. The news hit the family hard. Mrs. Patterson was a mess, but not in the way you'd expect. It was more about the what now than the what if. We were in their living room, Mrs. Patterson pacing like a caged animal. What are we going to do? The mortgage, the bills. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Mrs. Patterson, shouldn't we be more worried about Mr. Patterson right now? She rounded on me, her eyes sharp. Of course I'm worried about him, but life goes on, Emily. We have to think about these things. Linda was nodding along, ever the faithful echo. She's right, Emily. It's important to be practical. I looked at Mark, hoping for some support, but he just looked tired, torn between his ailing father and his panicking mother. I bit back any further comments. It wasn't the time or place. But as we left that night, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just Mr. Patterson's illness that worried me. It was the way Mrs. Patterson and Linda were so focused on the money, the house. It felt like priorities were all wrong, and I had a sinking feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. Mark's dad's condition worsened fast. It was like watching a candle flicker out. We were spending more time at their place, trying to be there for him, you know? But Mrs. Patterson, she was a whole different story. Always talking about the mortgage, the bills, as if that was the biggest worry. One evening, we were all there, the whole family. Mr. Patterson was lying in bed, looking frail and tired. Out of nowhere, he asked to speak to Mark alone. Just them two. It was strange, seeing him so serious. Mark looked taken aback, but nodded. Sure, Dad, let's talk. They went into the bedroom and closed the door. That's when I noticed Mrs. Patterson and Linda. They were like cats who heard a can opener. Their ears practically perked up. What do you think they're talking about? Linda whispered to Mrs. Patterson, not even trying to hide her curiosity. Mrs. Patterson had that look, you know, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. I don't know, but I bet it's about the will or the house. I was standing there, feeling awkward, when Linda turned to me. Emily, you must be dying to know, right? I mean, with your husband being the only son and all. I shrugged, not wanting to play into their game. It's their business. If Mark wants to tell me, he will. But inside, I was curious. What was so important that it had to be said in private? After what felt like ages, Mark came out. His face was unreadable. Mrs. Patterson and Linda pounced like hawks. "Well, what did he say?" Mrs. Patterson demanded. Mark shook his head. "It's personal, Mom. Dad just had some things to get off his chest." Linda tried a different angle. "But it must be about his will, right? Or the house?" Mark's expression didn't change. "Linda, I'm not discussing it. It was a private conversation." The air was tense after that. Mrs. Patterson kept shooting me these looks, like I was hiding something. But the truth was, I knew as little as she did. That night, back at our place, I asked Mark about it. "So, what did your dad want to talk about?" Mark was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me, his eyes serious. "He's worried, Em. About Mom, the house, everything. He just wanted to make sure I knew what to do, after—" I nodded, understanding. Of course, but deep down, I had this feeling that there was more to it, something Mark wasn't telling me. And whatever it was, I knew it was big. Mr. Patterson's passing hit everyone like a ton of bricks. It was one of those times when you realize life's too short, but some people never get that memo. The funeral was barely over when Mrs. Patterson started talking about the mortgage again. We were all at their house after the service, kind of a somber gathering when she brought it up. Now that he's gone, we need to think about the future. The mortgage on this house won't pay itself. Linda was nodding along, always her loyal supporter. It's a lot of responsibility, especially now. I was still in my black dress, feeling the weight of the day, when Mark's mom turned to me. "Emily, you recently came into some money, right? It only seems fair that you contribute, given the circumstances." I was stunned. Was she really asking me to pay off their mortgage with my inheritance? "Mrs. Patterson, it's not why Grandpa left me that money." Mark was rubbing his temples, looking like he wanted to be anywhere but there. "Mom, let's not do this now, please." But she was like a dog with a bone. "Mark, I'm just being practical. We're family, and families support each other. Emily, you can afford it now, can't you?" I felt my face getting hot. It's not about affording it. It's about what's right. That money was meant for me and Mark, for our future. Mrs. Patterson's face hardened. "Well, this is your family's future too, isn't it? Unless you don't consider us family." Before I could reply, Mark squeezed my hand. "Let's talk about this later, okay? It's been a long day." But Mrs. Patterson wasn't having it. "No, I want to know now. What will you do, Emily? Will you help your family or not?" The room was tense. Linda was watching me like a hawk, waiting for my response. I took a deep breath. We'll think about it, but this isn't the time or the place to decide." Mrs. Patterson seemed somewhat appeased, but her eyes were cold. "Fine, but remember, family is everything. We have to stick together." As we left, I felt Mark's hand in mine, tight and reassuring. But inside, I was reeling. The nerve of her, asking for my inheritance like it was nothing. It felt like she was trying to claim something that wasn't hers, and it didn't sit right with me at all. After much back and forth and a heavy heart, I decided to use my inheritance to pay off the mortgage on Mrs. Patterson's house. It was a decision I didn't take lightly, and I did it mostly for Mark's sake. We were at Mrs. Patterson's house for a dinner she organized to celebrate the mortgage being paid off. The whole event felt surreal, like being thanked for a favor I never wanted to give. As we sat down for dinner, Mrs. Patterson was beaming. "Emily, this is such a generous contribution you've made. We're all deeply thankful." I nodded, a tight smile on my face. "Happy to help, Mrs. Patterson." Then Linda chimed in with her usual saccharine tone. "Really, Emily, you're just too kind." The dinner was awkward but manageable, until Mrs. Patterson stood up with a glass in her hand for a toast. "I have something to announce. Now that the mortgage is taken care of, I've decided to give this house to Dave and Linda." My jaw dropped. "Excuse me? What did you just say?" I expected Mark to be as shocked as I was, but to my surprise, he just nodded and smiled. "Is that so, Mom? Interesting decision." His calm response threw me off. Why wasn't he upset? Mrs. Patterson looked pleased as punch. "Yes, it only seems right. They need it more, and after all, Emily, you and Mark are doing fine on your own." Linda's grin was wide, almost gloating. "We're just so grateful, aren't we, Dave?" Dave nodded, looking like the cat that got the cream. I was fuming, feeling betrayed and used. We paid off this house with my money. How can you just give it away to them? Mrs. Patterson's expression was firm, almost challenging. I'm still the head of this family, Emily. It's my decision to make. Mark's hand on my knee under the table was a silent message to stay calm. His eyes were telling me he had a plan. As the dinner descended into an uncomfortable silence, my mind was racing. What was Mark up to? He clearly knew something I didn't. The look in his eyes was not of defeat, but of someone holding an ace up their sleeve. As we drove back, I turned to Mark. You knew, didn't you? You knew what your mother was going to do. Mark's smile was mysterious. Let's just say, I had a feeling. Don't worry, Em. This isn't over yet. His words were cryptic, but they gave me a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we weren't as outplayed as I thought. Sitting in our living room, the tension was thick. Mark finally broke the silence. Em, there's something you should know. About the house. Dad did something before he passed. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. What are you talking about? Mark took a deep breath. Dad knew about Mom's plans with the house. He didn't trust her to do right by us. So he changed the mortgage and the house deed into our names. I was stunned. What? But how? He did it right after he found out about his illness, Mark explained. He wanted to make sure the house went to those who really paid for it. That's us, Em. We own the house now. I couldn't believe it. Mr. Patterson had seen through his wife's intentions and protected us. But why keep it a secret? I asked. Mark looked down. Dad asked me to. He didn't want more drama until it was absolutely necessary. Before we could talk further, there was an aggressive knock. Mrs. Patterson, Dave, and Linda stood at our door, their faces twisted in anger. Mrs. Patterson wasted no time. Mark, you need to explain this nonsense about the house. This is outrageous. Mark stood up, calm but firm. Mom, Dad knew what was happening. He legally transferred the house to us, the mortgage too. We paid it off, so now it's ours by law. Their reactions were explosive. Mrs. Patterson's face turned red with fury. That's impossible. He would never do that to me. Linda was almost hysterical. This is a lie. You're trying to steal our inheritance. Dave looked like he was about to explode. You can't just take the house, Mark. It's not yours. Mark handed them a folder. Here are the papers. The deed, the mortgage transfer, everything. It's all legal and binding. Mrs. Patterson snatched the papers, her hands trembling. As she scanned them, her face drained of color. This is a trick. You must have forced him, she screamed. No, Mom. Dad was clear-headed. He did this to protect what's fair, Mark replied, his voice steady. The argument went on, their accusations filling the room. But the truth was in black and white. The house was legally ours. You've torn this family apart, Linda yelled, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Patterson turned to me, eyes filled with hatred. You've done this, Emily. You and your money. But I stood my ground, feeling a sense of justice. No, Mrs. Patterson. This was Mr. Patterson's decision. He wanted to right a wrong. Eventually, they left, seething with anger and disbelief. The door closed behind them, leaving us in a bittersweet silence. We had the house, but at what cost? Yet, in my heart, I knew we had honored Mr. Patterson's wishes. He had given us a home, and in doing so, had also given us a new start. We thought the worst was over until Dave, red-faced with anger, burst into our house a few days later. You think you've won, huh? Dave was practically shouting. Dad paid a chunk of the mortgage before he died, $100,000. That means part of the house belongs to us. Mark remained calm, something I'd always admired about him. Dave, Dad thought of that. He asked me to deposit an equivalent amount into a separate account in case of disputes. I was standing in the corner, watching the scene unfold. Dave, his face a mix of anger and confusion, and Mrs. Patterson, who had followed him in, looking like a thundercloud. What? That's preposterous, Mrs. Patterson stammered. Mark continued. The $100,000 will be divided among the heirs, you, Mom, and me. That was Dad's wish. Mrs. Patterson was shaking with rage. This is a trick. You're manipulating everything. You've always been cruel and selfish. Linda, tears streaming down her face, joined in. How can you do this to your own family? It's heartless! The air was thick with tension and accusations. I felt a surge of courage and stepped forward. Enough! I raised my voice, something I rarely did. This is our home. Dad made his decision, and it's legal. It's time you all accept it. Dave was seething. This isn't the end, Mark. We won't let this go. Mark's response was firm, yet calm. You do what you need to, Dave. But this was Dad's decision. We're just honoring it. The confrontation ended with Mrs. Patterson, Dave, and Linda leaving our house, their threats and accusations still hanging in the air. As the door closed behind them, Mark and I were left in the quiet of our home, a mixture of relief and sadness in the air. Mark wrapped his arms around me. I'm sorry you had to go through all this, Em. I leaned into his embrace. It's not your fault. We did what was right. We stood there for a moment, in the home that had caused so much turmoil, but was now truly ours. The story ends with us, living peacefully in the house, while Mrs. Patterson moved in with Dave and Linda in their small apartment. It wasn't an easy victory, and the family ties were strained, but we had each other and a home that was ours, fair and square. That was enough for us.